Imagine you're cold, starving, and holding a piece of stolen bread, not for yourself, but for your sister's dying child. You're not a thief, you're not a criminal, you're just desperate. But society doesn't see desperation, it sees disobedience. This is how it began for him, not with rebellion, or violence, or ambition, but with bread. His name was once Jean. But names mean little when the world reduces you to a number. To them, he became prisoner 24,601, a branded soul in a system built to punish, not to understand. Before we begin, how are you feeling tonight? Are you lying down, eyes closed, letting the day fade quietly away? Wherever you are, I'm really glad you're here. And if you'd like, you can leave a little comment, your time, your city, just so I know where you're listening from. If this brings you peace, feel free to like and subscribe. No rush, just whenever you're ready. Now take a deep breath, and let's begin. He was a poor laborer. No education, no privilege, just calloused hands, tired feet, and a sense of responsibility. His sister had 7 children, and no food. One winter, when the youngest lay crying from hunger, he smashed a bakery window and took a loaf of bread. That decision cost him 19 years of his life, 5 for stealing, 14 more for trying to escape. Each failed attempt carved deeper into his humanity. Not only did they lock his body in chains, they tried to cage his spirit, as if hope itself was a crime. The prison was brutal. Hard labor, cold floors, fists, and insults, and a system that didn't care why you were there, only that you were. Every day, he woke up not as a man, but as an example. This is what happens when you defy the law. But what is law without justice? What is punishment without mercy? The guards called him dog. The system saw him as waste. But in those cold, empty years, something hardened inside him. Not just anger, but survival. He learned to lift iron like feathers, to endure pain like silence, to hide emotion behind a mask of control. The gentle man who once cried for a hungry child was gone. What remained was steel. When he was finally released, they handed him a yellow passport, a mark that would follow him like a curse. It declared to every town, every landlord, every employer, beware, this man is dangerous. No one hired him. No one welcomed him. He was spat on in the street, chased away from churches. Even dogs growled at his presence. He wandered for days, hungry again. Ironically, like the day he stole the bread. But this time, he didn't dare take anything. The world had already made it clear. He was not forgiven. One cold night, he curled up in a stable, shivering, soaked in rain, half mad with hunger and shame. He muttered to himself, maybe they were right. Maybe I am just a beast. But fate has strange ways of entering a story. An old man, a bishop, saw him lying there. Instead of calling the police, the bishop opened his door. Come, he said, you must be cold. Sit by the fire, I've made some soup. Jean stared, confused. He had been kicked out of barns. Now someone was offering him silver spoons. The bishop fed him, gave him warm clothes, even a soft bed. That night, Jean lay awake, restless. He couldn't sleep. His hands were used to shackles, not kindness. And then, temptation returned. In the middle of the night, he crept downstairs and stole the bishop's silver plates. The same man who fed him he betrayed by morning. He was caught by the police and dragged back to the bishop's door. This man claims you gave him your silver. The officer laughed. We know he's lying. But the bishop didn't say what they expected. Instead, He smiled and said, "Yes, I gave them to him. And Jean, you forgot the candlesticks too. Take them, they're silver as well." The police were stunned. Jean was more stunned. When they left, the bishop looked at him, not with anger, but with sorrow, and said, "Jean, my brother, I have bought your soul. I have ransomed you from hatred. Now, go and be an honest man." That moment shattered Jean. It wasn't the silver that weighed in his hands, it was mercy. He didn't understand. Why would someone forgive him? Why would someone protect him? He walked for miles that day, haunted by the bishop's kindness. At one point, he broke down, sobbing not like a criminal, but like a child. He realized that the world had tried to make him a monster, but this one man, with one act, had told him, "You are still human." From that day forward, Jean disappeared, not literally, but the man named Jean Valjean was reborn. He cast off the criminal identity, threw away the yellow paper, and vowed to live a life that honored the bishop's trust. He would become someone new, someone better, someone the world never expected him to be. But when the world gives you a second chance, it rarely gives you peace. Because even when you change your name, your face, your future, your past doesn't let go that easily. You can change your clothes, you can change your name, but can you ever truly escape the shadow of who you were? After that night at the bishop's house, the man once known as prisoner 24,601 disappeared into silence. The world believed he had vanished, and in many ways he had. But from that silence, a new man rose. He called himself Monsieur Madeleine. Nobody knew his past. Nobody asked. In a small town scarred by poverty and war, they only saw what he did, and what he did was build. He opened a factory, gave jobs to women, paid wages higher than anyone else. He helped beggars, rescued horses. He even funded schools and hospitals from his own pocket to the people. He was more than a businessman. He was a miracle, a quiet saint with calloused hands and sad eyes. Eventually, they made him mayor, but every night, when the town slept, he sat alone in his room and stared at 2 silver candlesticks, the ones the bishop had given him. They were never lit, just placed gently on the mantel, like 2 silent witnesses to a life borrowed. He wasn't hiding from the law because he feared prison. He was hiding because he didn't want to disappoint the one man who had believed in his goodness. But destiny, as always, doesn't leave loose threads untied. One day, a new police inspector arrived in town. His name, Javert, cold, exact, merciless. Javert didn't believe in second chances. To him, the law was not a tool. It was truth. It didn't care about kindness, or hunger, or why someone did what they did. It only asked, did you break the law? Yes or no? And Javert had seen this new mayor before. Somewhere, something about him, the strength in his arms, the quiet gaze felt familiar. He began watching. Whispers began to grow, small things. A child hurt in the street, and the mayor lifted a cart off his body with unnatural strength. Javert saw that, and his memory stirred. Could it be the man he had once guarded in the prison camps had become a mayor? No, it was impossible. But just in case, Javert wrote to the Central Police, asked them to confirm. Where was prisoner 24,601 now? Weeks passed. Then word returned. The real Jean Valjean, according to the police, had been caught. He had stolen something again, and this time he would never be released. The news stunned Mayor Madeleine because he knew the truth. that man was innocent. Someone else, poor, uneducated, and nameless, had been mistaken for him. And now that man would rot in prison. For his crimes, no one would know. No one would blame him. He had everything to lose. His life, his factory, the town's trust. And yet, he couldn't sleep. He walked the town at night. The silver candlesticks seemed heavier than ever. He whispered to himself, "If I stay silent, a man dies in my place. If I speak, everything ends. What would you do? Stay safe, or do what's right?" In the courtroom, the man was about to be sentenced. The judge read the papers. The chains were being prepared. Then the door opened, and Jean, the real Jean, walked in. "I am 24,601, he said softly. "That man is not me. I am the one you want." The room fell silent. The judge blinked. The prosecutor gasped. Even Javert, standing in the back, clenched his fists. It was unthinkable. A man had confessed to a crime that no one even knew he committed anymore. Why? Because it was the only way he could live with himself. He was arrested again. The papers ran wild. Mayor is a fugitive. Factory closes. Scandal in the north. But Jean didn't care. He had told the truth. And yet, destiny still had more to demand, because, before all of this, before the courtroom, the scandal, the unmasking, he had made one promise to a woman named Fantine. She was once an employee at his factory, a single mother, kind, proud, trying her best to stay afloat. But the world crushed her, like it crushes so many poor women without protection. She was fired, humiliated, and forced into the streets. To survive, she sold her hair, her teeth, her body, all to send money to a small child she loved, Cosette. When Jean found out what had happened to her, it was too late. She lay dying, feverish, in a hospital bed. But before she passed, she clutched his hand and whispered, "Promise me, take care of her. Take care of Cosette." And he had promised. So now, even as he faced arrest, even as the world turned against him, there was one mission that remained. Find the child. Save her. But Javert was closing in. A cat and mouse game had begun, not between a criminal and a cop, but between a man seeking redemption and a man who believed redemption didn't exist. Javert believed justice was simple. Wrong is wrong. Jean believed that justice without mercy becomes cruelty. And so, with nothing but a few coins, a borrowed coat, and a promise burning in his heart, Jean slipped through the shadows of the city, looking for a girl with no shoes, no future, only fear in her eyes. Her name was Cosette, and she would be the light he clung to, even as the night grew darker. It was Christmas Eve when he found her. The wind was sharp, the streets were silent, and the lanterns flickered like dying stars. Most people were home, warm beside fires, sharing bread and laughter. But not her. She was out in the dark, barefoot, alone, her tiny hands trembling as she carried a heavy bucket of water down a frozen path. She couldn't have been more than 8. Her name was Cosette. She belonged to the innkeepers, the Thénardier, a husband and wife who ran a roadside tavern, feeding travelers and collecting coins. But behind closed doors, they were something else, greedy, cruel, and heartless. Cosette was not their daughter. She was Fantine's child, left in their care years ago, with the promise that money would come. And money did come. Fantine had bled to send it. But Cosette never saw a single franc, while the Thénardiers dressed their own daughters in ribbons and lace. Cosette wore rags and swept floors. She was the invisible girl. the ghost under the stairs. The one who was punished when others misbehaved. She never cried in public. She had learned it made things worse. But that night, someone saw her. A tall man standing beneath a tree, wrapped in an old coat, quiet like the shadows themselves. His eyes followed her, not with suspicion, but with sorrow. He watched as she bent down, struggling to lift the water bucket almost her size. Her arms shook. She stumbled. The water sloshed onto her dress. But she didn't complain, just kept walking. That was the moment Jean Valjean knew. This was the child, the one Fantine had begged him to protect, the one the world had forgotten. He followed her back to the tavern, watched through the window as she was scolded for being slow, slapped for wetting the floor, then shoved toward the fire as if to be reminded, "This is heat, but not for you." Jean stepped inside. The tavern was loud, smoky, filled with laughter, but it all fell quiet when he entered. His presence wasn't threatening. It was still, like a storm that hadn't started yet. Madame Thénardier greeted him with a fake smile. "Welcome, traveler. Hungry? We have stew tonight." He nodded, ordered food, sat at a table. But his eyes stayed on the child. "Is she yours?" he asked, pretending casual interest. "Her." The woman laughed. No, just a servant, orphaned. We took her in, out of charity, of course." Jean said nothing, just smiled politely and passed her a gold coin. Suddenly, the tone changed. "Would you like a private room? A bath? Some wine?" He asked for none of it. Instead, after dinner, he walked back to Cosette. She was crouched under a table, holding a broken doll. It wasn't hers. She had picked it up in the street months ago. Its hair was missing. One eye was gone. "Is that your doll?" he asked gently. She shook her head, afraid to speak. He disappeared for a moment, then returned, holding a beautiful, brand-new doll wrapped in soft cloth. "Her name is Catherine," he whispered. "She's been waiting for someone kind." Cosette stared at him, unable to speak. No one had ever given her anything before. From across the room, Madame Thénardier saw what was happening. Her greed kicked in. "She's not for sale," she snapped. "The girl, she's ours. We raised her." Jean turned, placed several gold coins on the table. "How much?" he asked, voice calm. "To adopt her, officially, Monsieur Thénardier." Hearing the clink of gold, slithered from the back room like a rat smelling cheese, he raised the price. Jean added more. Eventually, they agreed, but it wasn't about money. It was about dignity. Jean knelt, looked Cosette in the eyes, and said the words no one had ever said to her, "You're coming home with me." She didn't understand, not at first. But when he took her hand, she didn't pull away. She had known hunger. She had known cold. But in that moment, she felt something she didn't have a name for: safety. They left the tavern that night. No luggage, no carriage, just a man, a child, and a doll. The snow fell silently behind them, but peace was short-lived. Javert was still hunting. The newspapers had died down, but his obsession hadn't. He had tracked Valjean across towns, cities, forests. He had questioned innkeepers, watched train stations, followed shadows. He believed no man could escape. Justice forever. And when he heard that a strange man had adopted a child and paid in gold, his instincts stirred. John knew time was short. He needed to disappear again. He bought forged papers, changed towns, lived simply, humbly, always moving. Cosette never asked questions. She just held his hand tightly whenever they walked. She called him Papa, and slowly, the man who had lifted a prison cart, who had faced a courtroom and walked back into his own chains, began to feel something new. So fatherhood, it was not loud or sudden, it was soft. Like when she learned to read and showed him the letter A, like when she fell asleep on his shoulder after their first Christmas together. He had never asked for a family. He thought redemption would come through sacrifice, but instead, it came through love. Cosette gave him something the world never had, a reason to live, not just survive. And he, in turn, gave her a life she never thought possible. A small apartment, a garden, a room with a window, fresh bread in the morning, a doll that didn't break, and a man who listened when she spoke. But, just as hope began to take root, Javert finally caught the scent, and this time, he wouldn't stop. When you run from the law, you run from more than just the police. You run from routine, from comfort, from names on doorbells and faces in the street. You run from the idea of home. But for Jean Valjean, home had become Cosette, so they ran together from town to town, changing names like old coats. Sometimes he was Monsieur Leblanc, sometimes Monsieur Fauchelevent, always quiet, always kind, but never still. Cosette never questioned why. She had learned early that Papa didn't talk about the past. He only looked forward, and when she asked why they moved so often, he'd simply say, "Some people like the stars, I like new skies." But behind his eyes, the worry never faded, because Javert was getting closer. There were moments, brief, terrifying moments, when Jean would see him, not clearly, just a figure in the distance, a shadow in the crowd, a man standing too long at the train station, and when that happened, they would leave everything behind. Again, one night, they took refuge in a convent. High walls, heavy silence, and rules thicker than scripture. The nuns didn't ask questions. Jean worked as a gardener. Cosette learned Latin prayers and proper etiquette. They stayed for years, and slowly, Jean started to believe it was over, that the world had forgotten, that justice had found new enemies, that maybe, just maybe, he had truly become someone else. Cosette blossomed. She sang while tending roses. She read books by candlelight. She grew tall, graceful, her childhood scars hidden beneath laughter and lace. But even as she changed, Jean stayed vigilant. He watched the gates. He avoided town. He kept the silver candlesticks, hidden relics of a life too dangerous to speak of. And yet, something else had begun to change too. She was growing up, and children, no matter how much they love you, begin to ask for more than safety. They begin to ask for freedom. It started with books about the world, then glances out the window, then soft sighs at night when she thought he wasn't listening. She wanted to see Paris, to walk among people her own age, to have conversations that didn't involve nuns or old men pruning trees. Jean saw it coming, and he feared it more than Javert, because when you've built your life around protecting someone, the idea of letting them go feels like death. He had fought to keep her alive, but now she wanted to live, so, finally, they left the convent. They moved into a quiet house in Paris, clean, modest, a garden for her, a reading room for him, close enough to society, but far enough from the noise. Cosette was radiant. Paris suited her. She laughed more, dressed brighter, asked questions about the world, and Jean watched quietly from behind the newspaper. But Paris was not the city it once was. Beneath the glitter and glamour, a storm was brewing. The streets were thick with tension. Students whispered of revolution. Workers gathered in alleys. Banners were painted in basements. And, among those voices, was a young man named Marius. He was everything Cosette had never seen. Handsome, idealistic, daring. He believed the world could change, that the poor deserved better, that the people had power. He marched in protests, read philosophy by candlelight, and when he saw Cosette in a garden one morning, his world turned. She looked at him, he looked back, and everything changed. Jean noticed it first. The way she smiled longer after coming back from walks. The way she stared out windows. The soft humming at night. He followed her one afternoon. Saw them meet at a bench. Hands touched, eyes closed. Nothing was said. Everything was felt. And Jean's heart cracked, not out of jealousy, but fear, love. He knew what it meant. It meant attachments, exposure, risk. He remembered what happened to Fantine, how love had once destroyed her life. He had promised to protect Cosette, but what if protection meant keeping her caged? And worse, what if Javert was still watching? The city was heating up. Barricades were rising. Gunpowder whispered through alleyways. The poor were preparing for something dangerous, something loud. Jean knew. When the city catches fire, no one is safe, not even young lovers in the garden. He confronted Cosette gently. "Do you trust me?" he asked. She nodded. "Then we leave soon." She didn't argue, but something inside her wilted. The glow faded. She didn't eat that night, and for the first time, Jean questioned himself. Had he truly become someone else? Or was he still the prisoner who only knew how to run? He looked at the silver candlesticks that night, held them in his hands. They weren't just reminders of mercy anymore. They were mirrors. He saw a man who had done everything right, who had changed, helped, sacrificed, but, in the process, had he become a jailer to the only person he loved? The law had chased him. Now he was becoming the law to Cosette. The next morning, he made a choice. He went out, alone, to find Marius, to look him in the eyes, and see if this boy, this stranger, was truly worth Cosette's heart. But what he found was something else. Gunpowder, flags, shouting. The city was at war with itself, and Cosette's future was standing at the edge of that fire. The city burned with songs of rebellion. It wasn't the kind of fire that destroys buildings. Not yet. It was the fire in people's hearts. Students shouting from rooftops. Factory workers painting slogans on brick walls. Children gathering stones for makeshift barricades. Paris was waking up, and when Paris wakes, the whole world trembles. Jean Valjean stood on a quiet corner, invisible in the chaos. He wasn't there to join a revolution. He wasn't a student, a fighter, or a dreamer anymore. He was there for one thing, Cosette, not because she was in danger, but because the boy who held her heart, Marius, was walking straight into war. Valjean watched from the shadows as Marius stood tall among the students, his coat-torn eyes wild, face glowing with belief. They were building barricades in the alleys, stacking furniture, sandbags, crates, turning the streets into battlegrounds. Marius wasn't hiding. He was ready to die for what he believed in, and that terrified Jean more than any prison guard ever had. But this story, this war, it wasn't really about revolution. Not for Jean. It was about a promise. A little girl, a broken doll. Because no matter how far they had come, he never stopped seeing her that way. Cosette, the child who once lived in silence. Cosette, whose hands once bled from scrubbing floors. Cosette, who had stared at his gift, the doll, as if it were a miracle. He saw her growing up, becoming a woman, falling in love. But inside, he still held the memory of that broken child, and now her happiness, her whole future, was tied to a man standing on a barricade with a rifle in his hand. Jean could have walked away. Let the revolution rage. Let fate decide. But he couldn't. He asked around, followed whispers, disguised himself, and finally, one night, with the smell of gunpowder in the air, he found the barricade, loud, crowded, men shouting orders, boys pretending to be men, flags waving like ghosts of France's past. Marius was there, loading ammunition, handing out bread, arguing about tactics. And Jean stepped into the fire. No one recognized him. He was just another shadow. But Marius noticed. He saw the man, the eyes, the calm, and he knew this wasn't a stranger. This was Cosette's father. They didn't speak, not at first, but the moment hung heavy. Finally, Marius whispered, "You shouldn't be here." Jean replied, "Neither should you." And then the shooting began. The government troops stormed the barricade at dawn. Bullets rained, cannons roared. Screams echoed against stone. The students fought bravely, fiercely, but one by one they fell, the dreamers, the poets, the poets, the poor, and in the chaos, Marius was hit, a blast. Smoke, silence. He collapsed, bleeding, half buried under rubble and bodies. Jean ran to him, lifted him limp, unconscious, and did what no one else could. He carried him through the alleys, past the fire, down into the sewers. Yes, the sewers of Paris. Dark, endless, filthy, a twisted maze of mud, rats, and stink. But Jean didn't care. He carried Marius on his back, step by step, for hours. No light, no direction, just one thought pulsing in his mind, for her. The water rose to his chest. His legs shook. He slipped more than once, but he never let go. Somewhere along that filthy path, surrounded by waste and silence, Jean Valjean made peace with who he was. Not a mayor, not a fugitive, not even a father, just a man who had loved, who had lost, who had been broken and rebuilt, a man who now carried the future of someone else's heart through the filth of a dying city. When he finally emerged, gasping, exhausted, soaked in mud, he laid Marius at the gates of a hospital, then disappeared into the night. He didn't wait for thanks. He didn't leave a name, but fate wasn't done with him yet, because someone had followed him. Javert, always Javert, the man who believed in the law more than life itself, the man who had spent decades chasing a ghost. He had seen Jean in the streets, followed him through the alleys, and now he had proof. Valjean, alive, active, guilty. He arrested him on the spot. But something had changed. Javert wasn't shouting. He wasn't smug. He was confused, because he had seen what Jean had done. He had watched him carry a dying man through hell, not for gain, not for escape, but out of love. And for the first time, Javert didn't know what to do. The world had always been black and white for him, but now, standing in front of Jean, covered in sewage, holding on to nothing but honor, he saw grey. Jean looked him in the eyes and said, simply, "Do what you must." And Javert did something unthinkable. He let him go. No handcuffs, no trial, no cell, just silence. And that silence would tear him apart. For all his life, Inspector Javert believed the world worked like a machine. There were rules. You followed them. There were laws. You obeyed them, and if you didn't, you were punished. No matter who you were or why you did it. The law, to him, wasn't just the system. It was sacred, unquestionable, pure. It gave him order. It gave him purpose. It made sense of a chaotic world. And most of all, it gave him identity. Because Javert had not been born into wealth or comfort. He was born inside a prison. His mother was a fortune teller, his father a galley convict. The kind of people society throws away. But Javert clawed his way out. He rose through discipline, through silence, through blind loyalty. He didn't just believe in justice. He owed it his entire life. And now, standing alone on a bridge, everything was falling apart. Because he had just let a fugitive walk free. Not because he was weak, but because he didn't know what was right anymore. Jean Valjean had shattered everything. For years, Javert believed he was chasing evil, a thief, a liar, a man who escaped justice. But now, he had watched that same man carry a dying boy through sewers. He had seen no fear, no hate, only duty, only love. The kind of love Javert didn't understand, because love had no rules, no ranks, no logic, and that terrified him. He walked along the Seine in silence. The moon hung low. The water reflected every doubt. He replayed the moment in his head, over and over. Jean Valjean, bloody and breathless, handing over a life he could have abandoned, and then surrendering himself. No excuses, no denial, just truth and mercy. That was the word that hurt most. Mercy, word, had never needed it, never given it. He believed mercy made men soft, made law uncertain. Mercy meant admitting that rules sometimes fail. But now, he had been shown mercy himself. Jean could have killed him, could have run, could have disappeared. Instead, he looked at Javert like a man looks at another man, not an enemy, not a monster. That was more painful than any prison sentence. Because if Jean Valjean was a good man, then Javert had been the villain all along. Everything he'd built, the years, the ranks, the clean uniform and heavy stare, it all meant nothing if he had been chasing the wrong man. And it wasn't just about Jean. It was about the system. What if the law wasn't always right? What if justice wasn't always just? He tried to return to duty, wrote reports, filed arrests, attended morning meetings, but his hands trembled when he signed his name at night. He sat alone, unable to sleep. He thought of the boy, Marius, alive, because of a criminal. He thought of Cosette, loved and protected by a man the courts condemned. He thought of himself, a servant of law who had never once asked why. He had obeyed every rule, and now those rules had betrayed him. By morning he couldn't bear it anymore. He walked again, back to the bridge. No bag, no coat, no destination. He stood there for a long time, watched the water flow beneath him, cold and endless, and for the first time in his life, he whispered a question that had never crossed his lips. What if I was wrong? There was no answer, only wind, only water, only silence. And in that silence, Javert did the only thing he believed he could do. He let go, not just of the railing, of the world, of the identity he could no longer carry, of the law that no longer made sense. And just like that, the man who never stopped running, stopped forever, far across the city. In a quiet garden, Cosette watched the sunlight filter through the trees. Marius, pale but recovering, sat beside her, unaware of the man who had saved his life, Jean Valjean. watched them from a distance. He had told Cassette nothing. He had told Marius nothing to them. He was just the quiet father figure, the gentle guardian, the one who always knew how to make things feel safe. But inside, Jean was tired, not physically, not even emotionally. He was tired of pretending he didn't exist. He had done what he promised, protected Cassette, saved Marius, paid every debt, and now, maybe it was time to disappear again. Not as a fugitive, but as a ghost. Because some people aren't meant to live in the spotlight. They're meant to stand just outside it, holding the light steady. He packed his things slowly, left the silver candlesticks on the table, and walked into the morning without saying goodbye. The barricades were gone. The slogans painted on the walls had faded. Paris was quiet. Again, but not healed. Beneath the surface, the city still throbbed with grief. Mothers searched for sons who never returned. Friends stood beside empty chairs. In cafes, children walked past bullet holes without asking questions. And in the midst of it all, two young people tried to learn what it meant to love after war. Cassette and Marius. Their story should have been simple. A garden, a bench, a shared glance. That was how it had started. But revolutions don't leave simple things untouched. Marius was no longer the same boy who had once blushed when Cassette smiled. He had seen death too closely, had held the bodies of friends, had heard the final gasps of boys who still believed they would live forever. And Jean Valjean, the man who had once carried him through hell, had vanished. Marius didn't understand why. He remembered glimpses of a shadow in the sewers, a voice, strong arms. But when he awoke in the hospital, Jean was gone. Cassette didn't understand either. Her father, her constant, her shelter, had grown distant. He had stopped walking with her, stopped reading in the evenings, stopped smiling at the small things. He said he was tired, that he needed rest, but Cassette felt it. A quiet goodbye, dragging itself out across days. She tried to talk to him. He brushed her hand and whispered, "You're happy now. That's all I ever wanted." She didn't know what that meant. Not really. And then, one day, he left. No letter, no note. Just the absence of a chair by the window. The space where his coat used to hang. Marius tried to comfort her. They had each other now. Wasn't that enough? They married in spring. The sun was kind that day. Paris wore flowers instead of flags. The streets were alive with music, not gunshots. Cassette looked like hope, and for a time, that was enough. But even love asks questions. And Marius, kind, serious Marius, had begun to ask himself the hardest one: who saved me? He knew Jean had been there. He remembered hands lifting him through the dark, a voice calling his name, the feel of mud, blood, and mercy. And then Javert was found dead. The timing was too close. It didn't make sense. Marius began to look deeper, quietly, carefully. He visited old streets, spoke to nurses, read records, traced paths through the sewers, and slowly the truth began to take shape. Jean Valjean had carried him. Jean Valjean had saved his life. Jean Valjean, the man he had once doubted, judged, even feared, was the only reason he was alive to love. Cassette, and he was gone. Marius was crushed. He had seen Jean as a mystery, a figure of the past, a shadow in Cassette's stories now. He saw him for what he truly was, a hero. But more than that, a father, one who had loved silently, sacrificed quietly, and never once asked for praise. Marius told Cassette everything: the sewers, the escape, the pain, the sacrifice, and together they went searching. Through towns, churches, letters, kind whispers from strangers who remembered a tall man with kind eyes, until finally, one evening, they found him, not in a hospital, not in a prison, but in a small, cold room above a chapel, sitting by a window, alone. He looked older, weaker, but when he saw them, he smiled. Cosette ran to him. He touched her cheek like she was still 8 years old, like she was still the girl with the broken doll. Marius knelt. He didn't speak, just placed a small bundle in Jean's hands. Inside a pair of silver candlesticks. They had found them in the old house, left behind like silent witnesses. Jean stared at them. Tears welled in his eyes. "I thought they were lost," he whispered. "They're part of you," Cosette said. "Just like we are." Jean leaned back, looked at the two faces in front of him, 2 lives he had protected. He didn't need more than that. The pain in his chest had grown stronger, the cough more frequent. He knew, but he didn't fear death. He had walked beside it for years. He feared only one thing, that they wouldn't understand. So that night he told them everything. The bread, the prison, the bishop, the lies, the escape, the chase, Fantine, Cosette, Javert, and the choice to step into the sewers, not to survive, but to save. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask for thanks. He just told the truth, as if setting it free. Cosette held his hand the whole time. Marius sat beside him, tears streaming silently. And when the sun began to rise, Jean closed his eyes. No chains, no guilt, no running, only peace. The greatest battles don't always happen under bright lights. Sometimes they happen in the dark, where there are no eyes to witness, no applause, no reward, just mud, pain, and silence. That was the sewer. The night Jean Valjean carried Marius through the underbelly of Paris. He wasn't just escaping bullets. He was stepping into a world that mirrored his own soul. Dark, filthy, forgotten, but still moving. The sewers of Paris in the 1800s weren't just drainage pipes. They were rivers of everything the city didn't want to face. Its waste, its secrets, its truth. And yet, they were also tunnels of survival. Jean descended with Marius on his back, heavy, unconscious, barely breathing. His boots slipped on slime. His shoulders screamed from exhaustion. The stink crawled into his lungs and wouldn't let go. But he kept walking. Why? Because the boy on his back wasn't just Cosette's love. He was Jean's chance to give something back to the world. This was the real redemption. Not the factories. Not the mayor's office. Not even the years he spent hiding. It was this moment, where no one was watching, that defined who he truly was. He could have let Marius die. No one would have blamed him. No one would have known. But Jean didn't need a witness. He needed peace, and every step in the dark sewer, every gasp for breath, every near fall was a confession, a prayer, a memory. He remembered his own escape, years ago, dragging chains behind him. He remembered Fantine's last words, "Take care of her." He remembered the bishop placing those candlesticks in his hands and saying, "I've bought your soul." All of it returned in that tunnel. Every pain, every debt, every decision. And as the weight of Marius grew heavier, Jean didn't weaken. He found strength in the mud. That's what makes him different. Most people only do good when it's convenient, when someone's watching, when the reward is clear. But Jean Valjean, he chose the sewer. He chose pain. He chose to carry someone else's future when his own was already fading. It was a crossroads, not of geography, but of the soul. Up above, the city raged, guns fired, barricades fell. Young men died for dreams too big for their own bodies. Down below, one man walked, quiet, steady, alone, through tunnels that stank of death. Toward the smallest light at the farthest end, he emerged not as a fugitive, not as a hero, but as a man who had done what needed to be done, even if no one would ever know. That moment in the sewer wasn't the climax of the story, it was the truth beneath it. It asked a question we rarely ask ourselves: what would you do if the world forgot you? Would you still do the right thing? Would you still carry someone else through the darkness? Would you still believe in goodness when no one is there to clap for it? That's what makes Gene unforgettable. Not because he loved Cassette, not because he ran from Javert, not because he changed his name and built a better life, but because, in the mud, in the dark, with nothing left to lose, he chose to be kind. And in a world like ours, that might be the rarest choice of all. Far from the sewers, back in the small room where he spent his final days, Gene never spoke much about that journey, not because he forgot, but because he believed it wasn't his story anymore. He had passed it on to Marius, who lived, to Cassette, who loved, to a city that might, one day, remembered in his final days. He never asked to be remembered as a savior. He asked only one thing, that Cassette be happy, because at the end of everything, the factories, the chasers, the names and numbers, he realized something. He had lived most of his life underground. Even above ground, he was hiding. But in carrying someone else through darkness, he had brought himself to light. Most people believe that strength is loud, that it wears armor, that it wins arguments, that it gets the last word. But Gene Valjean knew better. He had been strong in every way the world measures it, lifting carts, surviving prison, building factories, protecting a child, facing death. But none of it compared to the one moment when he did the hardest thing of all. He forgave. Not once, not twice, over and over again, he forgave the world that locked him away for a loaf of bread. He forgave the system that never looked at the reason behind the crime. He forgave the people who shunned him, spit on him, chased him. He even forgave Javert, the man who hunted him like an animal for decades. Think about that. Javert stood with the power of the state behind him. Gene stood with nothing. And when the moment came when Gene could have let him die, could have taken revenge, could have made Javert feel the fear he'd lived with for years, he didn't. He let him go. No hatred, no words, just quiet, steady mercy. Because Gene Valjean understood something Javert never could. Forgiveness isn't weakness, it's freedom. The law had shaped Javert into something rigid, cold, untouchable. But the law never taught him what to do with kindness. And when Gene showed him that, when he extended a hand instead of a fist, Javert shattered. Because mercy was never part of the system, but it was part of being human, and being human was something Gene had fought to reclaim. Even after prison tried to take it, even after society tried to crush it, he held on, not to pride, not to anger, but to the fragile, quiet belief that people can change. And that belief, it guided him every day of his life. When he took in Cassette, the daughter of a woman no one cared about, when he walked away from his power and reputation just to save an innocent man from being wrongly imprisoned, when he stepped into the sewers, knowing no one would ever thank him, he kept choosing to forgive, to show mercy, to be good, even when it cost him everything. That's not easy. That's not soft. That's a strength most of us only dream of having in his final days. When Marius and Cassette finally found him again, older, sicker, fading, he didn't ask for recognition. He didn't list his sacrifices. He didn't say, "Remember what I did for you." He just smiled, held their hands, and asked if they were happy. Because that's what love looks like. When it's pure, it doesn't demand, it doesn't control, it just gives and forgives in a world full of noise. Jean Valjean lived his final moments in silence, surrounded by peace he had never known in life, not in the factories, not on the run, not even in his moments of triumph. It was the silence of someone who had nothing left to fear, not because he won, but because he had let go of pain, of vengeance, of the past. He had become something rare, a man at peace with himself. It's easy to look at Valjean and see a saint, but he wasn't. He was flawed, angry, afraid. He made mistakes. He lied. He ran. He broke rules. But he always came back to one thing: the choice to be better. Not perfect, just better. And that's where the real message lives. Not in epic revolutions, not in dramatic deaths, but in the quiet, daily courage it takes to live with compassion, to choose forgiveness when hate feels easier, to choose healing when the wounds run deep, to choose to keep going when the world tells you it's over. He died in a small room. No statues, no grand funeral, no crowd of mourners, just a candle, 2 silver candlesticks, and the hands of the only 2 people he had ever truly called family. Jean Valjean passed from this world the way he lived in it, humbly, quietly, with no demand for praise. And yet, he left behind a legacy that echoes louder than any monument. Not in the headlines, not in the history books, but in the lives he touched. Let's be honest, by society's standards, he was nothing, an ex-convict, a runaway, a man with fake names and a record that followed him to the grave. But what did he really leave behind? A girl, Cassette, who grew up safe, loved and educated. A boy, Marius, who lived to marry, to build, to believe again after war. A police inspector, Javert, who, for one brief moment, saw that the world might not be so black and white. A city, Paris, that, even if it never knew his name, was changed by the ripples of the kindness he sowed. And, above all, he left behind an idea that redemption isn't a myth, that people can change, that mercy matters, and that even the most broken among us can become whole again. Valjean didn't ask to be remembered, but if you walk the streets of Paris today, you'll find his story hidden in the corners, not in statues, but in the quiet kindness of strangers. A man helping someone with their bag, a woman paying for a stranger's meal, a teacher staying after school with a struggling student, a tired mother whispering to her child, "I believe in you." None of them say his name, but they're part of his story, because the truth is, greatness doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears a threadbare coat. Sometimes it walks alone in the rain. Sometimes it carries a child through the dark and never asks for thanks. Jean Valjean was never a king, never a general, never a man with medals or memoirs. He was, as the title says, a miserable man, and yet he might be the greatest of them all. So, what is a legacy? It's not what you build. It's not what you earn. It's not even what people say after you're gone. Legacy is this: the choice you make when no one's watching, the lives you touch, even when they don't know your name, the good you do, not because you must, but because you can. That's what Jean Valjean gave the world. That's why, all these years later, his story still speaks to the outcasts, to the tired, to the ones who've been hurt and hardened by life. He reminds us, you are not your past, you are not your scars, you are the choices you make today, and today. You can choose to begin again, so now it's your turn, because the world doesn't need more perfection. It needs more people like Jean Valjean, people who are broken and still choose love, people who are chaste and still choose mercy, people who are tired and still choose to keep going. That's not weakness, that's the truest strength of all. Thank you for walking this path with me. If you want more stories like this, deeply human, softly told, and full of soul, subscribe to the channel. I'll be here, one story at a time, and remember, even the most miserable man can light the way for someone else. Good night.